More than just a biohazard. The blood pooling on the linoleum floor of Trauma Room 1 represented a ticking clock. Surrounded by shouting FBI agents, the man bleeding out on the gurney was a ghost, a high-value target pulled from a covert raid wreckage, and the sole person who knew the location of a planted dirty bomb. For 3 agonizing hours, 12 of the government's top linguistic experts and interpreters failed to decipher the dying man's frantic, guttural babbling, ultimately dismissing it as gibberish. But as a 23-year-old rookie nurse named Olive Jenkins changed his IV bag, her blood ran cold. It wasn't gibberish at all. It was the secret language of the people who had murdered her mother. Olive Jenkins had been a registered nurse for exactly 42 days. At 23, she was the youngest staff member in the emergency department at Chicago Presbyterian Hospital, a sprawling, merciless trauma center where the city's worst nightmares were wheeled through the double doors on a nightly basis. Olive was still in her grunt phase, assigned to the least glamorous tasks, changing soiled linens, holding emesis basins for drunk college students, and staying entirely out of the way of the senior attending physicians. It was a Tuesday night, unseasonably cold for October, and the ER was operating at a slow, manageable hum. Charge nurse Brenda Walsh, a 30-year veteran with a stare that could freeze water, was busy organizing the shift roster. Dr. Harrison Miller, the brilliant but notoriously abrasive lead trauma surgeon, was sipping terrible break-room coffee and complaining about the hospital administration. Olive was just finishing a shift inventory, her feet aching in her white clogs, quietly hoping the last 2 hours of her rotation would pass without incident. Then, the red phone rang. In an ER, the red phone is the harbinger of chaos. It bypasses the standard dispatch system. Brenda snatched the receiver, her face instantly draining of color. She didn't ask questions. She just listened, slammed the phone down, and hit the lockdown alarm. Code Black. Full federal lockdown. Brenda's voice boomed over the intercom, devoid of its usual dry sarcasm. Clear Trauma 1. I need Miller, Davies, and Jenkins. You're on fluids. Move. Before Olive could process the command, the ambulance bay doors were violently thrown open, not by paramedics, but by men in tactical gear carrying assault rifles. The hospital's standard security guards were immediately shoved aside as a swarm of black tactical vests flooded the triage area. Behind them came a stretcher, pushed at a dead sprint by 2 paramedics who looked absolutely terrified. On the stretcher lay a man in his late 40s, his chest a mess of crimson. He was handcuffed to the metal rails of the gurney, a jarring sight, considering he was missing half his blood volume. Gunshot wounds to the left upper quadrant and right shoulder. A paramedic shouted over the din, out of breath. BP is 70/40 and dropping. Heart rate is 140. We pushed 2 liters of saline, but he's bleeding out faster than we can fill him. Get him on the table, Dr. Miller barked, snapping on his sterile gloves. Jenkins, get me 2 large-bore IVs in him, now. We need O-negative blood hanging yesterday. Olive sprinted to the bedside, her hands shaking slightly as she ripped the packaging off the IV catheters. The patient was thrashing wildly, his eyes wide and dilated, filled with a primal terror. He wasn't just in pain. He was fighting a war inside his own head. He had a thick, unkempt beard, deeply tanned skin scarred by harsh weather, and calloused hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime gripping steel. As Olive leaned in to find a vein in her right arm, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder, nearly pulling her off her feet. You keep him alive, a deep, authoritative voice commanded. Olive spun around to find a man in a sharp suit over a Kevlar vest, his badge clipped to his belt. He had iron-gray hair and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in a decade. Agent Thomas Brody, Federal Bureau of Investigation, he announced to the room, although his eyes were fixed on Dr. Miller. This man does not die, Doctor. If he dies, a lot of innocent people in this city are going to join him. Do you understand me? I understand that you're in my light, Agent Brody, doctor. Miller snapped back, entirely unimpressed by the federal credentials. Back up or I'll have security remove you. Guns or no guns. Jenkins, where is my access? I have it, Olive called out, successfully threading the needle into a rolling vein, despite the patient's violent thrashing. She taped it down and immediately hooked up the bag of O-negative blood. The room was a hurricane of organized medical violence. They cut away the man's shredded clothes, revealing a torso covered in old, jagged scars, burn marks, knife wounds, and things that looked like torture brands. This man had lived a life of extreme violence long before tonight. He's crashing, Brenda yelled, pointing to the monitor as the steady beeping turned into an erratic, frantic screech. VFib, paddles, charge to 200, Miller ordered. Olive stepped back as Miller shocked the patient. The man's body arched off the table with a sickening thud. Nothing. Charge to 300. Clear. Another shock. This time, the monitor caught a rhythm. A weak, thready sinus tachycardia, but it was a heartbeat. The bleeding from the shoulder was clamped, and Miller packed the abdominal wound with hemostatic gauze, buying them precious minutes. The patient gasped, his eyes flying open. He looked directly at Agent Brody, his chest heaving, bloody saliva bubbling at the corner of his lips. He began to speak. It wasn't English. It was a rapid, raspy torrent of harsh consonants, guttural stops, and strange, melodic vowels. He sounded angry, desperate, and completely alien to everyone in the room. Brody lunged forward, pressing a digital recorder near the man's face. "Where is it? Where is the device?" Brody screamed in English. The man just kept speaking that strange, rhythmic language, his voice growing weaker, coughing up blood. "I need a translator," Brody yelled at the other agents in the room. "Get DC on the line. Get everyone. We have less than 4 hours before the timer hits 0. Olive stood in the corner, her hands covered in the stranger's blood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the man on the table, listening to the harsh, violent syllables tearing from his throat. She felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down her spine. The sounds he was making, she had never heard them in Chicago. She had never heard them in America. But somewhere, buried deep in the darkest, locked vault of her childhood memories, a faint, terrifying echo began to ring. The emergency room was no longer a hospital. It had become a forward operating base. Tactical agents secured every exit, communications vans blocked the ambulance bays, and Trauma 1 was transformed into a high-tech interrogation room. The patient, officially designated as John Doe, but referred to by the agents as the asset, had been stabilized just enough to remain conscious. Dr. Miller had explicitly warned that putting the man under general anesthesia for surgery would likely kill him given his current trauma, and the feds had ruthlessly agreed to delay the operation. They needed him awake. Agent Thomas Brody paced the floor like a caged tiger. The stakes had been briefed to the senior hospital staff in a hushed, terrifying 2-minute huddle. The man on the bed was a rogue operative tied to an Eastern European arms cartel. A radiological dispersion device, a dirty bomb, had been armed somewhere in the downtown Chicago area. This man was the courier who knew the location, and he had been double-crossed by his own people. "Time is running out," Brody muttered, staring at the digital clock on the wall. "Get the first interpreter on the speaker." A junior agent adjusted a secure military-grade communications console they had wheeled into the room, patching through to Ahmed Rahman, senior State Department linguist, Arabic and Levantine dialects. A crisp voice cracked over the speaker. "I am here, Agent Brody. Play the audio." Brody hit play on the recording they had just captured, while the live patient continued to mutter deliriously on the bed. The harsh, clicking consonants filled the sterile room. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Agent Brody," Rahman said slowly, "that is not Arabic. It is not Farsi, Pashto, or Dari. There are no Semitic root structures. I have no idea what that is." Useless, Brody snarled, cutting the connection. Next, for the next 2 hours, the trauma room turned into a modern-day Tower of Babel. The FBI cycled through their absolute best. Interpreter number 2, Dr. Aris Petrov, a foremost expert in Russian, Ukrainian, and Slavic languages, listened to a live feed. Yet, Petrov concluded, sounding baffled. There is a slight cadence that mimics Chechen, or maybe Dagestani, but the vocabulary is entirely wrong. It's almost as if he's speaking backwards, or using a cipher. Interpreters 3 through 7 were patched in from the NSA and the CIA. They tried Turkish, Kurdish, Armenian, Georgian, and even obscure Romani dialects. Every single, highly paid, heavily credentialed expert gave the same frustrated response. It sounded familiar in its aggression, but the actual words were a linguistic black hole. The patient's heart rate began to climb again. He was sweating profusely, fighting against the restraints, his eyes rolling back. He yelled a specific phrase repeatedly. Zharka Tsunel, Vakhtar, Zharka Tsunel. Brody slammed his fist against the metal cabinet. 8 hours! We have maybe 8 hours before half this city is breathing in radioactive dust, and nobody can understand a damn word this terrorist is saying. Agent Brody, his blood pressure is dropping again, Dr. Miller warned, checking the monitor. He's going into hypovolemic shock. If you don't let me take him to the OR in the next 20 minutes, he's going to bleed out internally, and your bomb is going to detonate. You keep him awake. Brody roared, drawing his weapon half an inch from its holster in pure, blind stress before catching himself. We have one more expert coming, an academic. Minutes later, the heavy doors to the ER swung open to reveal Dr. Sylvia Caldwell. She was a renowned linguistics professor from the University of Chicago, flown in via a police helicopter. She specialized in dead, dying, and undocumented indigenous languages. If anyone could crack the code, it was her. Dr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses, walking straight to the bed. She didn't flinch at the blood or the guns. She leaned down, putting her ear close to the dying man's mouth. Speak to me, she whispered in a dozen different tongues. Russian, Old Georgian, Avar, Circassian. The man looked at her, his eyes glassy. He coughed, blood sprayed onto her white blouse, and forced out another string of the guttural dialect, ending with a soft, mournful sound that almost resembled a chant. Dr. Caldwell stood up, his face pale. She looked at Agent Brody and shook her head. I'm sorry, Agent. You're dealing with a ghost. What does that mean, Doctor? Speak English, Brody demanded. It means, Caldwell said, wiping the blood from his cheek with a tissue, that he is speaking an isolated cryptolect, a secret language, based on the phonetic structure. It's a splinter dialect from the high Caucasus Mountains, likely passed down orally within a specific, closed-off cartel or blood feud family. It was designed intentionally so that outsiders could never understand it. It has never been recorded in any database. The 12 people you just called failed, because this language doesn't officially exist. Unless you happen to have a member of his specific mountain tribe in the room, you will never know what he is saying. Silence fell over Trauma 1, broken only by the rhythmic, failing beeps of the heart monitor. Brody looked completely defeated. The senior FBI agents exchanged grim looks. They had lost. Millions of people were in danger, and the only key was locked behind a linguistic door that couldn't be breached. Prep him for surgery, Brody finally whispered, running a hand over his face. If he dies, he dies. I have to call the director and order an evacuation of downtown Chicago. In the far corner of the room, near the biohazard bins, Olive Jenkins stood frozen. She was holding a plastic bag of contaminated gauze, her knuckles white. She was trembling, not from the fear of the bomb, not from the intimidating federal agents. She was trembling because she understood exactly what the dying man had just said. Olive Jenkins was not born in Chicago. She was not born Olive Jenkins. According to her American adoption papers, she was an orphan from Eastern Europe, brought to the States when she was 7 years old by a loving couple from Illinois. Her adoptive parents knew very little about her past, only that she had been found wandering near the smoldering ruins of a remote village near the perilous border of Georgia and the Chechen Republic. What the adoption agency didn't know, what Olive had spent 16 years desperately trying to bury beneath a normal American life, nursing school, and a bright smile, was the truth of her early childhood. She hadn't just wandered out of a war zone. She had been hidden in a root cellar for a year by her grandmother, a fierce matriarch of a splinter smuggling clan. Her biological family had been wiped out by a rival faction men who wore black masks and spoke a very specific, brutal dialect, the language her grandmother had whispered to her in the dark to keep her quiet, the language the masked men had shouted as they burned their home to the ground. The ghost tongue. Olive stared at the patient on the table. The phrase he had been screaming, Jar Katsunel, Vakhtar Dr. Caldwell had called it a cryptolect. To Olive, the translation hit her brain like a physical blow. Jarka meant the iron belly, or the metal beast. Tsunel meant weeping, or leaking. Vakhtar was a specific, localized slang for the subway tunnels beneath the city. He wasn't praying. He was telling them exactly where the bomb was. The weeping metal beast in the subway. An abandoned, leaking train car underground. Agent Brody, Dr. Miller said, his voice completely professional now that the medical crisis was taking precedence. We are moving him. Everybody clear the room. Jenkins, unhook the secondary monitor. We're taking it with us. Olive didn't move. Her feet felt like they were cemented to the linoleum. If she spoke up, she would be exposing the darkest, most traumatic part of her soul. She would invite the federal government into her carefully constructed, safe American life. They would dig into her past. They would see the scars she hid beneath her scrubs. But if she didn't speak, millions of people, including her adoptive parents who worked downtown, would die. Jenkins, Brenda Walsh snapped, clapping her hands. Did you hear the doctor? Unhook the monitor. The patient groaned, his head lolling to the side. His eyes met Olive's across the room. In that fleeting second, she didn't see a terrorist. She saw the ghosts of the valley. She saw the old men, with their scarred hands. She smelled the wood smoke of the Caucasus, and she heard the lullabies her grandmother used to sing. Olive dropped the biohazard bag. It hit the floor with a wet, heavy thud. She stepped away from the wall. He says it's in a train car, Olive said. Her voice was quiet, but in the tense silence of the room, it ranged out like a gunshot. Everyone froze. Agent Brody turned around slowly, his brow furrowed in confusion. Doctor? Miller paused, holding a blood-soaked sponge. Dr. Sylvia Caldwell, the linguistics genius, blinked at the young, blonde nurse in the stained scrubs. Excuse me? Brody said, taking a step toward her. What did you just say? Olive swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She walked past Brenda, past the armed guards, stepping directly into the center of the trauma bay, right next to the FBI lead agent. He said, Jar Katsunel. Vakhtar, Olive repeated, her voice gaining strength, the strange, guttural syllables rolling off her tongue with perfect, native fluency. It roughly translates to, the leaking metal beast in the tunnels. It's cartel slang from the Kisnak border region. He means an abandoned subway car. The bomb is underground. Agent Brody stared at her, completely bewildered. He looked at Dr. Caldwell, who was staring at Olive with her mouth slightly open in absolute shock. Is this a joke? Brody demanded, his face flushing with sudden anger. Who is this kid? Miller, control your staff. We do not have time for a nurse looking for 15 minutes of fame. Agent Brody, I assure you. Dr. Miller started, stepping in to protect his rookie. I am not joking, Olive interrupted, her voice suddenly possessing a steel that stopped Miller in his tracks. She looked Brody dead in her eyes. Dr. Caldwell is right. It's a dead language. It's an oral code used by the Highland smugglers. The world thinks it died out 20 years ago. But it didn't. Brody sneered, stepping into her personal space, trying to physically intimidate her. And how exactly would a 23-year-old nurse in Chicago know a dead terrorist code language? Because, Olive said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, the men who spoke it murdered my family. Before Brody could react, Olive turned her back on the federal agent and leaned over the dying man. She placed her bare hand on his uninjured shoulder, right over a faded tribal tattoo she recognized instantly. She took a deep breath, reaching down into a place she hadn't touched since she was a terrified 7-year-old girl in the dark. Makal, Boers, Olive spoke. The words felt like gravel in her throat. Don't sleep, wolf. The effect was instantaneous. The dying man's eyes snapped open. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor suddenly leveled out as the panic left his system, replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. He stared at the young American woman in a white nursing uniform, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Hearing his native, sacred tongue from her was like witnessing a miracle. Kata, I have scraped, coughing up a fine mist of blood. Who are you? Sok Nadare, Olive replied smoothly, her tone authoritative and demanding. I am the daughter of the valley. Tell me which tunnel. Tell me now, before the darkness takes you. The man stared at her, tears suddenly mixing with the blood on his face. He gripped Olive's wrist with astonishing strength for a dying man. He pulled her down to his mouth and whispered 3 quick sentences. Olive stood up, her face pale, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned to Agent Brody, who was staring at her as if she had just performed witchcraft. The red line, Olive said, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear of the patient, but from the horrifying weight of the information. He says the device is on an abandoned maintenance train on the red line, parked under the Washington Street station. But what? Brody demanded, already keying his radio to dispatch tactical units to the subway. But what? Jenkins. Olive looked at the floor, a cold dread washing over her. He didn't just tell me where the bomb is. He told me who armed it. She looked up, making eye contact with the FBI agent. He says it wasn't his cartel. He says the man who hired him, the man who double-crossed him and armed the bomb, is your boss. The room went dead silent. Agent Brody's hand slowly fell away from his radio. The silence in Trauma Room 1 was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with the metallic scent of blood and raw adrenaline. The steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor was the only sound anchoring the room to reality. Agent Thomas Brody stared at 23-year-old Olive Jenkins. His hand was hovering inches from his sidearm. He had spent 20 years hunting ghosts in the darkest corners of global terror networks, and he had never felt the ground drop out from beneath him quite like this. Say that again, Brody said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all his previous bluster. It was the icy, calculated tone of a predator assessing a threat. Olive didn't flinch. Her hands were still stained with the dying man's blood, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the metal gurney. He said the man who hired him, the man who armed the radiological device, is the one commanding this operation. Your boss, Special Agent in Charge, Richard Sterling, Brody murmured, almost to himself, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Sterling was a decorated veteran of the Bureau, the man who had mentored Brody, the man currently sitting in the mobile command center 3 blocks away, directing the entire federal response to this crisis. This is absurd, one of the junior tactical agents barked, stepping forward, his rifle shifting slightly. Brody, she's compromised. Or she's out of her mind. We need to relay the red line intel to sack Sterling immediately so he can send the bomb squad. No, Olive yelled, her voice echoing off the tile walls. If you tell Sterling, he'll know the courier talked. He'll detonate it remotely right now to cover his tracks. You have to bypass him. Step away from the patient. Jenkins, the junior agent ordered, raising his weapon a fraction of an inch. aiming it generally toward the medical team. Before Olive could react, Dr. Harrison Miller stepped directly into the line of fire, his broad shoulders shielding his rookie nurse. He held up his bloody, gloved hands. "Put the gun down, son. You are in my ER, and you do not point firearms at my staff." "Doctor, move." "Shut up, Collins," Brody snapped at the junior agent. He didn't look away from Olive. His mind was racing through 1,000 terrifying variables. Sterling had been the one to tip them off to the courier's location tonight. Sterling had explicitly ordered the asset taken alive, but had heavily delayed the medical evacuation. Sterling had insisted on managing the linguistic team himself, cycling through experts rapidly. Was he hoping they would fail? Was he stalling until the courier bled out? Brody looked at the man on the table. The courier's eyes were closed again, his breathing shallow and wet. "Ask him for proof," Brody ordered Olive, his voice tight. "If Sterling is the architect, he left a signature. Ask him how he knows it was my boss." Olive leaned back over the patient. She pressed 2 fingers to his carotid artery, feeling the weak, thready pulse. She leaned her mouth close to her ear. "Bors," she whispered, using the honorific for wolf again. "Dakhal, Vaktar Sterling. Mateza? Wake up. Sterling. How do you know?" The man's chest hitched. He didn't open his eyes this time. It took every ounce of his failing strength to push the air past his vocal cords. "Otso, Harcha, Zelto, Harcha." He went entirely limp. The heart monitor flatlined, emitting a solid, piercing, continuous tone. "He's coding!" Brenda Walsh shouted, instantly slamming her hands onto his chest to begin chest compressions. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine. Miller, he's gone. Get the crash cart," Miller roared, shoving Olive out of the way to take over the airway with a bag valve mask. The room exploded back into medical chaos. But Olive was frozen, her back pressed against the cold stainless steel cabinets. Brody grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her away from the frantic resuscitation efforts. "What did he say?" Brody demanded over the noise of the flatline alarm. "Jenkins, what did he say?" Olive looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with a horrific realization. He said, "Otso Karcha, Geltu Karcha." It means the blind eye, the yellow eye. Brody let go of her, as if he had been burned. "I have stumbled back to a step, Agent Brody." Dr. Sylvia Caldwell, the linguistics professor who had watched the entire exchange in stunned silence, finally spoke up. "Does that mean something to you?" Brody's face was the color of old parchment. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He brought up a secure directory and opened the profile picture of Special Agent in Charge, Richard Sterling. Sterling was a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, and in his left eye, the result of an IED blast in Baghdad 20 years ago, was a highly distinctive, custom-made glass prosthetic. The iris was a striking, pale, amber color, a yellow eye. "God Almighty," Brody whispered. He looked at Olive. The doubt was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a grim, terrifying certainty. "Sterling is the mole, and he has complete control of the grid. Time of death, 23:14. Doctor." Miller announced heavily from the center of the room, stepping back from the table. The courier was gone. The only man who knew the exact mechanics of the bomb was dead. Brody instantly keyed his earpiece, but he didn't switch to the command frequency. "I have switched to a secure, encrypted point-to-point channel. Ramirez. Cole. Meet me at the ambulance bay. Blackout protocols. Do not ping command." He turned to the junior agent. "Collins. Collins, you and the rest of the detail lock this room down. Nobody goes in or out. If Sterling calls for an update, you tell him the asset is still alive but unconscious, and Dr. Miller is operating. Buy me time." "Brody, what are you doing?" Collins asked, panicked. "I'm going to the red line," Brody said. He grabbed an extra Kevlar vest from a tactical bag on the floor and shoved it into Olive's chest. "Put this on." Olive stared at the heavy black armor. "What? Why?" Because, Brody said, checking the magazine in his Glock. The device is military grade, and if Sterling built it, it's rigged with fail-safes. The courier was supposed to arm it. If there's a digital interface, or an analog codebook down there, it's going to be written in that dialect to ensure local bomb squads couldn't defuse it, even if they found it. You're the only person on this continent who can read it. I'm a nurse, Olive protested, her voice cracking. I save lives. I don't go into subway tunnels with bombs. Do you want to save lives? Brody pointed a finger at the floor. There are 3 million people above us right now who are going to burn if we don't stop this. You are drafted, Jenkins. Let's go. The unmarked black SUV tore through the desolate streets of downtown Chicago, its headlights completely extinguished. Agent Brody drove with terrifying precision, utilizing night vision goggles, while Agents Ramirez and Cole, two heavily armed men who looked like they chewed gravel for breakfast, sat in the back, silently checking their submachine guns. Olive sat in the passenger seat, the heavy Kevlar vest swallowing her small frame. The scrub top beneath it was still damp with the dead courier's blood. She felt numb, her mind desperately trying to compartmentalize the trauma. She closed her eyes, and the memories she had repressed for over a decadence flooded back the smell of burning pine, the harsh, barking orders of the masked men, her grandmother's rough hands pushing her down into the dark earth of the root cellar. Don't make a sound, my little bird, her grandmother had whispered in the cryptolect. The wolves are above us. Now, Olive was heading underground to hunt a wolf. We're a block from the Washington Street station, Brody announced, his voice tight. The station was closed for renovations 6 months ago. The power grid to the lower maintenance levels is supposed to be dead, but Sterling likely routed a ghost line to keep the bomb's telemetry active. If Sterling is monitoring the area, he'll see us coming, Ramirez noted from the back seat. Not if we take the old access grates in the alley, Brody said. He slammed on the brakes, throwing the SUV into park in a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway behind a towering office building. The team piled out rapidly. The cold October wind cut through Olive's scrubs, making her shiver violently. Brody grabbed a heavy crowbar from the trunk and jammed it into the edge of a rusted, heavy iron grate set into the concrete. With a grunt of exertion, he heaved it upward. The smell of ozone, damp earth, and ancient iron wafted up from the black abyss below. Ramirez, take point, Brody ordered. Cole, cover the rear. Jenkins, you stick to me like glue. Don't touch anything. Don't make a sound. Understand? Olive nodded stiffly, gripping the small flashlight Brody had handed her. They descended a rusted steel ladder into the oppressive darkness of the maintenance shafts. The descent felt endless, taking them deep beneath the active transit lines, into a forgotten layer of Chicago's underground infrastructure. When Olive's feet finally hit solid concrete, she felt the vibrations of an active train rumbling somewhere far above them. Down here, it was silent as a tomb. They moved in a tactical formation, the sweeping beams of their tactical lights cutting through the thick dust in the air. The walls were lined with decaying pipes and archaic electrical boxes. Water dripped rhythmically from the ceiling, echoing loudly in the enclosed space. We're approaching the abandoned spur, Brody whispered, holding up a clenched fist to halt the team. The track diverges here. The maintenance train should be parked about 200 yards down. They rounded a curve in the tunnel, and the beams of their flashlights hit a massive shape resting on the rusted tracks. It was an old, yellow maintenance locomotive, coupled to a single, windowless boxcar, the weeping metal beast. There it is, Cole murmured. Sweep the perimeter, Brody ordered. As they moved closer, the beam of Olive's flashlight caught something on the side of the boxcar. It wasn't standard transit graffiti. It was painted in stark, fresh, white paint. Jagged, angular symbols. Olive's breath caught in her throat. Brody, stop. Brody froze, instantly raising his weapon. What? The side of the train, Olive whispered, pointing her light at the symbols. It's the cryptolect. It's written phonetically in Cyrillic characters. Brody stepped closer, keeping his eyes scanning the darkness. Translate it. Olive squinted at the harsh, jagged letters. The letters translated to sounds, and the sounds formed the words of her nightmares. Dakal, Zar, Mateza. She swallowed hard. It says, "The trap is set. The eye sees all." A sharp, metallic click echoed through the tunnel. It wasn't a drip of water. It wasn't the settling of the train. It was the sound of a heavy bolt being pulled back on a high-powered rifle. "Drop the weapons, Brody." A smooth, calm voice echoed from the darkness at the far end of the tunnel, amplified slightly by the acoustics of the concrete walls. "Or, my men will cut you and your team in half." From the shadows behind the maintenance train, 4 tactical floodlights snapped on simultaneously, shielding Brody, Olive, and the 2 agents. Olive threw her hands up over her face, squinting against the blinding glare. Silhouettes stepped out from behind the floodlights. 5 men, wearing unmarked tactical gear, carrying assault rifles leveled directly at them, and stepping out from the center of the group, wearing a pristine tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in the filthy tunnel, was Special Agent in Charge, Richard Sterling. Even from 20 yards away, Olive could see the unnatural, pale, amber gleam of his left eye reflecting the harsh light. "You were always too stubborn for your own good, Tommy," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should have stayed in the ER." Brody didn't lower his weapon. He kept it aimed dead center at Sterling's chest. "It's over, Richard. I know about the dirty bomb. I know you armed it." Sterling chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Over? Tommy, my boy. It's just beginning. The device in that car is going to wipe out the financial district, and when the dust settles, the blame will fall squarely on that foreign courier, who tragically died in surgery. The Bureau gets a massive budget increase. The Patriot Act gets a fresh coat of paint, and I retire as a national hero who tried to stop it." "You're a monster," Brody spat. "I'm a pragmatist," Sterling corrected. He glanced at Olive, tilting his head. "I was listening to the ER feed, Tommy. Imagine my surprise when a 20-something nurse started speaking a dead dialect my mercenaries used in the Caucasus 20 years ago. It's a small world, isn't it, Miss Jenkins?" Olive felt her blood turn to ice. His mercenaries. The masked men who had burned her village, who had slaughtered her family. They had been working for Sterling. This corrupt federal agent had been running Black Ops terror campaigns across the globe for decades. "Kill the agents," Sterling ordered casually, waving a hand. "But shoot the girl in the legs. I need her alive to translate the courier's final abort code, just in case the timer malfunctions. Fire." The command "fire" had barely left Special Agent Richard Sterling's lips when the subterranean tunnel erupted into deafening, blinding violence. But Thomas Brody had not survived 20 years in the Bureau's most dangerous divisions by being slow. A fraction of a second before Sterling's mercenaries squeezed their triggers, Brody had already moved. He grabbed the thick collar of Olive's Kevlar vest and violently yanked her downward, throwing his own body weight over hers as they plummeted onto the grease-stained concrete. At the exact same moment, Agent Ramirez, operating on pure tactical instinct, unclipped a flashbang grenade from his chest rig, pulled the pin with his teeth, and hurled it directly at the shielding floodlights. Bang! The concussive shockwave of the stun grenade was magnified 100-fold by the enclosed concrete walls of the subway tunnel. The 4 high-intensity floodlights shattered instantly, plunging the cavernous space back into chaotic, strobing darkness, illuminated only by the frantic muzzle flashes of automatic gunfire. "Covering fire! Move to the train!" Ramirez roared over the deafening rattle of his own submachine gun. Bullets chewed through the air where Olive and Brody had been standing a heartbeat earlier, sparking violently off the rusted tracks and pulverizing the concrete pillars into lethal shrapnel. Cole grunted loudly as a round clipped his shoulder, spinning him around, but the veteran agent recovered instantly, dropping to one knee and laying down a suppressing volley of 9mm rounds that forced Sterling's men to dive for cover behind the concrete pylons. "Up! Jenkins! Get up!" Brody shouted, his voice hoarse. He hauled Olive to her feet. Her ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine, her vision swimming from the flashbang. Pure adrenaline dumped into her system, overriding her terror. Brody shoved her toward the massive, yellow steel wheels of the maintenance locomotive. They scrambled over the rusted coupling and threw themselves against the heavy sliding door of the windowless boxcar. Ramirez, Cole, fall back, Brody bellowed, slamming his shoulder against the rusted latch of the train door. It wouldn't budge. Damn it, it's jammed! Bullets began pinging off the thick steel hull of the train car, sounding like giant, angry hornets. One round shattered a cast-iron pressure valve inches from Olive's head, showering her with rust and freezing water. Olive looked at the locking mechanism. It wasn't just rusted. It was secured with a heavy, modern, biometric padlock. And next to the padlock, painted in the same fresh white paint, was another sequence of the cryptolect. Kokma, Olive read aloud, her voice trembling but clear. What? Brody yelled, firing blindly into the darkness to keep the mercenaries pinned. It says Chokma. It means blood or lineage, Olive shouted, grabbing Brody's arm and pointing to the biometric scanner. Brody, the courier. His blood. Brody looked at Olive's scrubs, which were soaked in the dead courier's O-negative blood from the trauma room. Without hesitation, Brody grabbed her right hand, pressing her blood-slicked palm directly onto the glass panel of the biometric scanner. The machine beeped a sharp, electronic chirp that cut through the gunfire. The heavy steel deadbolts inside the door clacked open loudly. Cole, Ramirez, get in here, now, Brody roared, hauling the heavy sliding door open. Cole practically dived through the opening, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Ramirez backed up slowly, firing his weapon until the slide locked back empty before leaping into the train car. Brody grabbed the handle and slammed the heavy door shut, plunging them into pitch blackness just as a fresh hail of bullets struck the exterior metal. For a terrifying second, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and Cole's muffled groans of pain. Then, motion sensors inside the boxcar clicked. A series of dim, red LED strips flickered to life along the ceiling, bathing the interior in a sinister, bloody glow. Olive turned around, and her breath hitched in her throat. Sitting in the dead center of the train car was a nightmare of engineering. It was a massive steel drum, roughly the size of a commercial washing machine, lined with thick lead plating. Strapped to the outside of the drum were blocks of pale C4, explosive, wired meticulously to a central casing. But it was the detonator that made Brody's blood run cold. It wasn't a standard timer. It was a rigged, dual-screen military tough pad, hardwired into the firing mechanism. One screen displayed a countdown clock in glowing red digits. The other screen displayed an audio waveform graphic, currently flatlined, with a blinking cursor beneath a single word written in Cyrillic letters. A dirty bomb with an acoustic lock, Brody whispered, walking slowly toward the device, his weapon lowered. Sterling didn't build this part. The courier modified it. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the train car rattled violently. Brody! Sterling's voice boomed through a portable bullhorn from outside, his calm demeanor replaced by genuine, panicked fury. Brody, listen to me. You can't defuse it. The courier double-crossed me. I have locked the remote receiver out of the grid and rigged a dead man's acoustic trigger. If you cut the wires, it blows. If the timer hits 0, it blows. He wants the girl, Ramirez wheezed, sitting against the wall and applying a tourniquet to Cole's arm. That's why he told them to shoot her in the legs. He needs her to speak to the damn machine. Tommy! Sterling shouted from outside, the sound of heavy tools striking the door echoing loudly. The timer is at 4 minutes. Bring the girl out here. She reads the abort phrase. We shut it down, and we all walk away. If you don't open this door, we all die in the fire. Brody looked at Olive. The 23-year-old nurse was staring at the bomb, trembling violently. Jenkins, Brody said softly, stepping between her and the explosive. Look at me. Olive ripped her eyes away from the ticking numbers and looked at the veteran agent. "Is he telling the truth?" Brody asked. "Can you read what's on that screen?" Olive stepped cautiously toward the device. She peered at the glowing Cyrillic text beneath the audio waveform. The letters were arranged to mimic the harsh phonetic sounds of her grandmother's secret tongue. She read the words, and a cold, terrible understanding washed over her. "Yes," Olive whispered. "It's asking a question, a riddle. It's an old Kisnak proverb. You have to speak the answer into the microphone to disarm it. Then tell me the answer, and I'll say it," Brody said. Olive shook her head, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. "You can't. The software is voice print, matched to the dialect's tonal frequency. Dr. Caldwell said it in the ER. It's an isolated cryptolect. It has glottal stops and pitch drops that Western vocal cords literally cannot replicate unless you learned it before you were 7 years old. If you say it with an American accent, the machine will register it as a failed attempt." She pointed to a small warning label on the screen. 3 failed attempts, and the C4 detonates instantly. "Then you have to do it, Olive," Brody said, his voice stripped of all his federal authority, leaving only the desperate plea of a man trying to save his city. Olive stared at the screen. The proverb written there was, "When the wolf howls at the iron door, what does the daughter of the valley offer?" Her grandmother had told her this story in the root cellar. The wolf represented the brutal mercenaries, the cartels, the men who came to take and kill. The iron door was their home. "Open the door, Brody," Sterling screamed, the sound of a blowtorch now hissing against the metal outside. Sparks began to shower into the red-lit room from the hinges. 2 minutes. Open the damn door." Olive closed her eyes. She was back in the dark. She was 7 years old, covered in dirt, smelling the smoke of her burning village. She remembered asking her grandmother the same riddle. "What do we offer the wolf, babushka? Do we offer him meat?" "No, my little bird," her grandmother had whispered, pressing a cold, iron dagger into her tiny hands. "We offer him the blade." The steel door of the train car groaned in agony as the blowtorch outside sliced through the heavy locking deadbolts. The interior was filled with acrid, metallic smoke, choking the red-lit air. "He's almost through," Ramirez coughed, struggling to his feet and raising his empty weapon like a club, ready to fight hand-to-hand to his last breath. Brody stood next to the bomb, his gun aimed directly at the center of the sliding door. "Jenkins, whatever the answer is, you need to say it now. We are out of time." Olive stepped up to the tablet. The microphone glowed with a faint, pressing green light, waiting for the audio input. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely keep herself upright. The trauma of her childhood, buried for 16 years beneath American pop culture, nursing textbooks, and a desperate desire to be normal, was clawing its way out of her throat. She looked at the prompt. "When the wolf howls at the iron door, what does the daughter of the valley offer?" Olive took a deep, ragged breath. She leaned down until her lips were an inch from the microphone. She closed her eyes, picturing her grandmother's face, channeling the fierce, unyielding strength of the women of the Caucasus Mountains. She opened her mouth, and the words tore out of her harsh, guttural, and laced with a centuries-old fury. "Shateza, vach, koch matsunel, nachta." We offer no meat. We offer the bleeding iron. The waveform graphic on the screen spiked wildly, tracing the complex, jagged frequencies of the dead language. The screen flashed yellow. Suddenly, the heavy sliding door of the boxcar was violently wrenched open. Fresh air and blinding flashlight beams flooded the compartment. Richard Sterling stood in the doorway, a suppressed pistol in his hand, his amber glass eye reflecting the red emergency lights of the train car. Behind him, 2 of his mercenaries had their rifles raised. "Step away from the bomb!" Sterling screamed, aiming his weapon directly at Olive's head. "Drop it, Richard," Brody yelled, firing his last 3 rounds. 2 struck the mercenaries, dropping them instantly. The third grazed Sterling's shoulder, spinning him, but the corrupt agent fired wildly in return. A bullet grazed Brody's thigh, sending him crashing to the floor. Sterling lunged into the car, his face twisted in pure, animalistic panic. He didn't care about Brody or the agents anymore. He only cared about the timer. He lunged toward Olive, raising his pistol to strike her out of the way so he could see the screen. "I said get away from it!" Sterling roared. But as Sterling's hand came down, the tablet emitted a loud, sustained, dual-tone chime. The glowing red numbers on the countdown clock freeze. System disarmed. Fuse severed. The terrifying hum of the internal electronics slowly wound down, leaving a heavy, stunned silence in the boxcar, broken only by the sound of Brody's heavy breathing and the distant drip of water in the tunnel. Sterling stared at the screen, his chest heaving. The bomb was dead. The threat was neutralized. The destruction of Chicago had been confirmed by 14 seconds. He slowly lowered his gun, a look of profound, devastating realization washing over his face. He looked at the 23-year-old nurse standing next to the bomb, her scrubs covered in blood, her posture straight and unbroken. "You," Sterling whispered, the fight completely draining out of him. "You spoke it." "Yes," Olive said, her voice eerily calm, the accent of her American upbringing completely restored. She looked at the corrupt federal agent dead in his identical eyes. "And I know what you did to my village. You left orphans. Now, an orphan just dismantled your empire." Before Sterling could raise his weapon again, a shadow moved from the floor. Brody, ignoring the bleeding wound in his leg, launched himself upward. He tackled Sterling with the force of a freight train, driving the corrupt agent backward out of the train car and onto the hard concrete of the tunnel floor. Sterling's pistol clattered away into the darkness. Brody pinned him down, drawing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, and brutally ratcheted them onto his former mentor's wrists. "Richard Sterling," Brody panted, his voice echoing in the damp tunnel. "You are under arrest for domestic terrorism, treason, and the murder of a federal asset. You have the right to remain entirely silent." Brody looked back up into the train car. Olive was slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, her hands covering her face as the adrenaline finally crashed, leaving her sobbing not from fear, but from the overwhelming release of a lifetime of carried grief. Ramirez hobbled over to her, awkwardly patting the rookie nurse on the shoulder with his uninjured arm. "You did good, kid. You did real good." The city of Chicago woke up the next morning, entirely unaware of the apocalypse that had slept beneath its streets. The news reported a minor gas leak that had briefly closed the Red Line, and a vague federal corruption bust. By 8 a.m., Olive Jenkins was sitting in the hospital break room, wrapped in a blanket, sipping terrible coffee. Dr. Harrison Miller walked in, looking at her not as a rookie grunt, but with profound, quiet respect. He didn't ask questions. I simply placed a fresh set of scrubs on the table. Olive changed, washed the blood from her hands, and clocked back in for her next shift. She had spent 16 years hiding from the ghost of her past, terrified it would destroy her life. Instead, that ghost had saved 3 million people. The 12 greatest linguists in the nation had failed, but the orphan had spoken, and the wolves were finally silenced.